The date is the 29th of December 1940. The time is precisely 6:05 p.m., and the fading winter light is about to be violently replaced by a manufactured artificial dawn of fire. The air above the Thames estuary, usually cold and damp, is now a thermal river, carrying the smell of coal smoke, burning timber and ozone from the massive detonations. The city of London, the heart of an ancient empire, is under systematic attack. This is not the targeted precision bombing that will later define the war. This is the Terrorangriff, the terror raid, and the night's objective is the total psychological and structural collapse of the British capital. Altitude, 15,000 feet. The bomber stream is a relentless kilometer-long chain of aircraft, primarily Dornier Do-17Z and Heinkel He-101H bombers, each carrying a deadly mixed payload. The low guttural thrum of their Jumo 211 engines is a sound that, for months, has replaced the clock chimes and church bells as the auditory signature of London life. Tonight, the load is disproportionately weighted toward the incendiary bomb, the Electron Brand Bomb, or EB, a magnesium-cased hell device designed to start fires that the local services simply cannot contain. The Luftwaffe High Command, acting on the directive of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, believed they had found the mathematical breaking point. Intelligence suggested that the sustained loss of housing and the constant disruption of sleep, the sheer grinding fatigue of terror, would force the population to demand surrender. Göring famously declared, "The British people are like a sponge. One must only squeeze them until they drip." And yet in the apocalyptic panorama unfolding below, the sponge was refusing to yield. In a reinforced concrete bunker, 40 feet beneath the shattered pavement near St. Paul's Cathedral, American General Frank R. Maxwell, a pragmatic observer sent by Washington, watched a single flickering emergency lamp illuminate a map of the unfolding devastation. Maxwell was not interested in heroism. He was interested in logistics and arithmetic. His mission was to determine if Britain was a sound investment for the nascent Lend-Lease program, which was already diverting millions of dollars and tons of material, tanks, destroyers, aircraft, that many in the U.S. military argued should be reserved for American defense. Maxwell's initial provisional report to the War Department was stark. The industrial base is fragile. While the RAF has won air superiority in the day, the night attacks are unsustainable. The rate of loss of critical infrastructure, water, power, transport, exceeds the rate of repair. Unless an immediate large-scale intervention of manpower and material occurs, the strategic utility of the British Isles will be negated. This was the prevailing strategic consensus. Britain was running on borrowed time and rapidly approaching a terminal decline. But General Maxwell was about to witness a factor that defied all known military calculus, the sheer illogical and stubborn resilience of the common man. Down in the East End Docklands, where the smell of burning sugar and tea mingled with the acrid smoke of explosives, the true resistance was in full swing. This resistance was not dressed in khaki, but in blue siren suits and steel helmets marked ARP, Air Raid Precautions. Their weaponry was the antiquated hand-pumped stirrup pump and the sandbag. These civilians, mostly men too old or unfit for the military, or women released from factory work, were fighting a war of inches against an enemy that rained fire from the heavens. Mrs. Agnes Pritchard, an auxiliary fire service, AFS volunteer from Poplar, recounted the sheer scale of the terror. The docks were a single enormous pillar of fire. The noise wasn't just loud, it was physical. It pressed on your chest. But we had a job. The Germans wanted us to run, that's all they wanted. And when you realize that, you just pump harder. You don't think about the roof over your head, you think about the roof of the man next to you. The tactical response was based on desperate, decentralized action. With water mains fractured and communication lines cut, isolated groups of volunteers were fighting dozens of simultaneous, localized battles. This was the brilliant, if accidental, counter-strategy, decentralized command leading to resilient defense. Up above, in the claustrophobic cockpit of a Heinkel, Oberleutnant Victor Hess viewed the scene with a mixture of professional awe and detached cruelty. His mission log recorded the immense scale of the blaze. The target area is fully engulfed. The flames are visible from beyond the coast of France. They must be broken now. No city can withstand this. Hess and his comrades were convinced that their massive industrial and technological advantage, the precision engineering of the German air fleet and its weaponry, guaranteed victory. The supreme irony that General Maxwell was slowly grasping was that the Luftwaffe's single-minded focus on terror was creating the very conditions for an unbreakable social cohesion. Every bomb that missed a specific military target, and many did, landed indiscriminately, reinforcing the idea that this was not a war against soldiers, but against everyone. This shared fate, this baptism by fire, was welding the British people into a single defiant unit, an invisible strategic asset that no German intelligence officer had the capacity to measure. Maxwell, witnessing the reports of firefighters returning to the line after being dug out of rubble, began to see the cold arithmetic of war fail before the heat of human will. The fight was not over material, it was over persistence. And tonight, the persistence of the ordinary Londoner was turning the tide. If this deep dive into the hidden resilience of the Blitz sparks your interest in the forgotten corners of World War II history, hit the subscribe button. We uncover the stories that changed the course of the war, one chapter at a time. The initial American assessment of Britain's chances was not cruel, but purely pragmatic, rooted in the painful lessons of early 1940. France had possessed a superior army, an extensive defense line and vast resources, yet had collapsed in 6 weeks. Britain, an island under constant aerial assault, seemed merely to be awaiting the final crushing blow. The American Observer Group, established in mid-1940, consisted of engineers, logistical experts, and intelligence analysts, all tasked with evaluating the cold, hard data of attrition warfare. Their brief was to answer one question for President Roosevelt: is continued aid to Britain a strategic necessity or merely a generous diversion of assets needed for American self-defense and the burgeoning Pacific crisis? The numbers were horrifying. German bombing raids, while not destroying overall British industrial output, were crippling the logistical chains necessary to sustain a modern war economy. The attacks targeted ports, Liverpool, Bristol, Southampton, creating an acute bottleneck. Shipping losses in the Atlantic were astronomical, peaking at over 800,000 tons per month by early 1941, meaning essential Lend-Lease goods often failed to reach the very ports the Germans were trying to obliterate. Major John V. Carter, a logistical analyst, detailed the mathematical disparity in his private correspondence to the Pentagon. We estimate the maximum sustainable loss rate for housing is approximately 1,000 units per week to prevent catastrophic social breakdown. Current German raids are exceeding this by a factor of 3. The industrial workforce is being displaced faster than it can be rehoused. The output of vital aircraft, such as the Hurricane and Spitfire, already only managing barely 500 units per month, will soon decline due to fatigue and displacement. This is a war of arithmetic, and the British are currently losing the equation of recovery versus destruction. The German strategy, rooted in the theories of air power pioneer Julio Douhet, aimed precisely at this equation. Douhet argued that an undefended civilian population would quickly force the government to capitulate, making ground invasion unnecessary. The Luftwaffe's tactical implementation involved a relentless search and destroy pattern against urban centers, employing powerful SC-500, Sprengbomb cylindrisch 500 kilos, high-explosive bombs to crater roads, rupture water mains and destroy communications, effectively paralyzing the defense infrastructure. British defense technology, while brilliant in the air, the chain-home radar system being the game-changer of the Battle of Britain, was rudimentary on the ground. The civilian shelters, the iconic Anderson shelter, a buried corrugated iron arch, and the indoor Morrison shelter, a reinforced steel table, were lifesavers against peripheral blast and shrapnel, but offered no guarantee against a direct hit by a heavy SC-1000 bomb. The physical defense was inadequate. The psychological defense had to compensate. The British Ministry of Information, acutely aware of the American observers, worked overtime to project an image of unbreakable, almost phlegmatic stoicism. But the internal reality was a struggle against exhaustion and trauma. Mr. George Dixon, a railway signalman essential to keeping the shattered rail network operational, spoke of the constant mental strain. It was the noise you couldn't stand. The sirens, then the engines, then the crump. Every time you went to your post, you wondered if that was the night. But you knew that if you stopped, the whole line stops, and if the line stops, the ammo stops. So, you keep pulling the levers. The fear is there, but the necessity is stronger. This necessity, the fierce, almost religious commitment to maintain the system, no matter the personal cost, was the factor that Major Carter and his statistical models had overlooked. They measured steel and concrete. They failed to measure social capital. The American assessment assumed that rational self-interest would lead to a widespread demand for peace. They were wrong. Instead, the shared exposure to indiscriminate violence forged a radical new social contract. People who had been bitter neighbors one week were risking their lives to pull each other out of the rubble the next. The civilian defense structure, the one. 5 million volunteers of the ARP, AFS, and WVS was a logistical system of collective, decentralized action that operated purely on civic duty, not military command. As the historian A.J.P. Taylor would later write, the bombing of the cities, intended to shatter morale, became the great leveler of British society. When a German bomb could fall on Buckingham Palace or a slum in the East End with equal impunity, class and status became irrelevant. General Maxwell, poring over the revised figures of industrial output that showed minimal decline despite maximum destruction, began to understand. The British were not winning the war of destruction, but they were decisively winning the war of recovery rate. They were inventing, moment by moment, the concept of anti-fragile logistics, systems that, instead of breaking, grew stronger, faster, and more unified when placed under extreme stress. This realization was the single most powerful justification for the commitment of America's vast industrial power. The island was not a doomed liability. It was the most resilient and therefore most valuable strategic base on Earth. General Maxwell's decision to leave the relative safety of the underground command bunker and observe a raid in the docklands was an attempt to reconcile the conflicting data, the catastrophic destruction versus the persistent recovery. He needed to see the human mechanism driving this paradox. He chose to shadow a firewatch team in the Surrey Commercial Docks area, a place targeted for its massive stores of timber and grain, perfect fuel for the German incendiary strategy. The raid he witnessed was the pinnacle of German firebombing technique, designed to overwhelm the fire brigade. Tactically, the German approach involved two waves. The first, the Pathfinders, dropped flare bombs to illuminate the target, followed by incendiary rain, hundreds of thousands of small 1-kilo magnesium electron bombs. These started countless small scattered fires. The second wave, arriving 20-30 minutes later, dropped the heavy high-explosive Ichi bombs, specifically targeting the roads, fire stations, and known rendezvous points of the emergency services. This was a sophisticated, deadly dance designed to annihilate the defense force. Maxwell was paired with section leader Bill Jennings, a former crane operator now serving full-time with the AFS. Jennings's team of 5, operating a trailer pump unit, was fighting a blaze that had engulfed an entire 6-story tea warehouse. The temperature radiating from the fire was so intense, it forced the men to work through a blinding haze of steam and heat, their faces blistered despite the heavy canvas coats. The equipment was often inadequate. The trailer pump they relied on could throw a serious jet of water, but it often failed due to shrapnel damage or low pressure from the broken mains. Jennings's strategy was one of damage limitation and resource conservation, fighting multiple small fires to prevent a single catastrophic conflagration. In the midst of the chaos, Maxwell watched as a Junkers Ju-88, flying terrifyingly low due to the obscuring smoke, dropped a stick of 4 SC-250 HE bombs. One struck the corner of a street, vaporizing a row of smaller buildings. The air pressure hit Maxwell like a physical fist, momentarily stealing his vision and breath. When he recovered, covered in grit and dust, he saw the man nearest the impact. Not Jennings, but a young messenger boy named Tommy who had been relaying a message, shaking but instantly grabbing a stirrup pump and attacking a new, small fire started by burning debris. Maxwell shouted over the ringing in his ears, "Your station is gone, the water is low. Why are you not pulling back to a reserve position?" Jennings, drenched and focused, didn't even look at the general. He simply pointed his gloved hand toward a small residential street threatened by the spreading fire. That's 36 people, General. They have the underground. We have the line. We don't pull back. We hold this line. If we pull back, the fire runs. The fire is the enemy, not the plane. The profound impact on Maxwell was the realization that this was not military courage, which is born of training and unit loyalty. This was an almost instinctive commitment to community survival. These men and women were not fighting for queen or empire at that moment. They were fighting for the street, the block, the neighbor. Later, Maxwell would detail this phenomenon in his report, using the language of military strategy to describe civilian action. He noted that the decentralized immediate response of the ARP and AFS units effectively denied the Luftwaffe its tactical objective of achieving widespread conflagration. The rate of intervention was simply too fast for the German high explosives to keep up with. The general, an expert in maneuver warfare, had just witnessed the ultimate defensive strategy, unyielding presence. The Germans could bomb the streets, but they could not bomb the will of the people to be on those streets, fighting the resulting fires. The physical loss was high, but the logistical and moral paralysis that the Luftwaffe intended never materialized. This experience shattered Maxwell's skepticism. He concluded that the British people possessed an unquantifiable strategic asset, an infinite, self-renewing determination. His private journal entry from that night captured the fundamental shift. They told me they were running out of material. They did not tell me they had a limitless supply of courage. We are not investing in a dying nation. We are investing in a crucible that is forging the most resilient ally we could ever hope for. The logic of defeat is invalid here. Following his field observations, General Maxwell and his team were forced to redefine their entire analytical framework. They had been assessing the war with a 1918 perspective, focused on armies and industrial capacity. The Blitz demanded a total reconsideration of the role of the civilian population as a strategic, combatant force. The data now focused on recovery metrics that defied conventional military wisdom. Absenteeism rate. Despite the massive trauma, absenteeism in key war factories, aircraft, munitions, shipbuilding, never rose above 8% for any sustained period, a figure astonishingly low for a population under relentless air assault. Infrastructure repair speed. The time taken to restore a ruptured main railway line, often requiring thousands of feet of new track and ballast, averaged less than 48 hours, often achieved by volunteer crews working under ongoing attack. Industrial decentralization. The efficiency of the Shadow Factories program, which dispersed manufacturing into smaller, often hidden rural sites, meant that even a direct hit on a major plant resulted in only a marginal dip in national output. The Americans now realized they were dealing with an economic organism that was virtually immune to decapitation. This astonishing resilience created a strategic paradox for the German command, a concept the military historian Sir Basil Liddell Hart would later label the paradox of overkill. The more destructive the attack, the more it reinforced the unity and determination of the target. In Berlin, the frustration was palpable. German aerial reconnaissance confirmed the scale of the fires and the damage, yet subsequent intelligence reports showed British industrial production increasing, not decreasing, in sectors like radar and aircraft components. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, commanding the German air fleets, expressed his bewilderment in a frustrated staff meeting, reports of which eventually reached Allied intelligence. "We are expending thousands of tons of ordnance, diverting crews from the Eastern Front, and yet the factories are still turning. Their losses are immense, but their will is not diminished. We have failed to locate the center of gravity of this resistance." The center of gravity was not a factory, nor a command bunker, but the unified will of the civilian defense corps. Maxwell's revised report highlighted this human factor using quantitative data. The immense, sustained effort of the 1.5 million civil defense volunteers, a force larger than the entire British Army at the time, was a strategic reserve of unparalleled worth. Colonel Stone's revised analysis hammered the point home. The British have internalized the threat. They treat the air raid siren not as a signal to flee, but as a signal to engage. The German aim was psychological collapse. The result has been psychological stealing. The trauma has become a source of strength. This conclusion led directly to the famous shift in the American perception of the war. Aid to Britain was no longer a gamble, but a sound investment. The Lend-Lease Act, which had been politically contentious, suddenly gained vital military justification. In practical terms, this meant a massive, rapid increase in the delivery of key logistical support, communications equipment, heavy construction machinery for rubble clearance and repair, and critically, thousands of miles of prefabricated bridging and railway material. The US was now actively equipping the British capacity to endure and recover, not just to fight. General Eisenhower, the future Supreme Commander, articulated the enduring strategic lesson. The true measure of a nation in war is not how much it can destroy, but how much it can absorb and still function. The people of Britain absorbed the worst of modern warfare and never stopped building planes, never stopped repairing rails, never stopped answering the fire bells. Their endurance was the original, unshakable foundation of the entire Western Front strategy. The calculus of the soul had proven that the value of human will, when unified and organized, utterly surpassed the cold, destructive power of the heaviest German high explosives. The strategic shift following the American Observer reports resulted in a monumental technological and logistical partnership, a transatlantic industrial pipeline focused on turning Britain into the essential, unsinkable aircraft carrier for the eventual liberation of Europe. The focus moved from simply surviving to escalating production under fire. The British, with their genius for improvisation, and the Americans, with their capacity for mass production, formed a formidable combination. The technological ingenuity applied to industrial survival was remarkable. To protect vital tool-making capacity, specialized jigs and presses were moved into bomb-proof underground facilities, including unused sections of the London Underground and deep limestone quarries. This process, often involving the dismantling and reassembly of massive machinery, was an engineering feat performed under continuous risk. The Shadow Factories program became a technological model for decentralized production. For instance, the manufacture of the sophisticated Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the power plant for the Spitfire and Hurricane, was spread across dozens of smaller, geographically separate plants, ensuring that the destruction of any single location could not halt the entire production line. The scale of the Lend-Lease commitment, justified by British resilience, was staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, the US provided aid valued at over $31.4 billion, equivalent to hundreds of billions today. This included over 1,500 locomotives and nearly 20,000 railway wagons, logistical arteries designed to replace those damaged by German bombs. The logistics of getting these materials ashore were a triumph of joint effort. The ports were perpetually under attack, necessitating the invention of new offloading techniques and the use of coastal barges to ferry cargo from larger ships anchored further out at sea. The dedication of the dock workers and the civilian fire teams was non-negotiable. Mr. Stanley Hewitt, a foreman at the Liverpool docks, recounted the sheer pressure of unloading American material while German flares illuminated the sky. The crates were essential: aircraft parts, generators, steel plate. We worked in shifts, under fire, knowing that if we stopped, the guns in the desert would run silent, or the planes wouldn't fly. The Americans saw the smoke, but they didn't see the sheer pace we were working. We had to unload 10,000 tons of supplies in a single 24-hour cycle while the Luftwaffe was overhead. It was a race against fire and time, every single day. This constant, high-stakes logistical operation taught American strategists a crucial lesson: the importance of system redundancy in a total war scenario. The British had multiple backup power systems, multiple water sources, and multiple command structures for every vital service. This was resilience by design, forged in the heat of combat. The German response remained technologically focused, but strategically blind. They continued to refine their bomber guidance systems and increase bomb loads, convinced that a heavier hammer would eventually break the foundation. They failed to realize that the Allied foundation was no longer composed of fragile single points of failure, but a vast, interconnected web of resilient communities. The exchange of technological know-how was equally crucial. The British, masters of radar and early jet propulsion, shared their secrets, while the Americans provided expertise in mass production and complex engineering. The result was a synthesis of invention and manufacture, a technological alliance built upon the absolute certainty that the island base would never fall. The enduring industrial engine of defiance had earned the trust of the world's greatest industrial power, making the eventual counter-invasion inevitable. The final, definitive, strategic endorsement of the British civilian experience came with the full-scale deployment of American forces to the UK, beginning with Operation Bolero in 1942. Great Britain was officially transforming from a besieged nation into Fortress Britain, the massive staging ground for Operation Overlord. The strategic influence of the Blitz experience permeated every layer of Allied planning. The key principle, learned from the civilian defense, was operational continuity under duress. The entire logistical plan for D-Day had to assume that the Germans would attempt a counter-blitz against the staging areas and ports. The lessons learned in London, bomb-proof communication, rapid debris clearance and redundant supply lines, became standard operating procedure for the American military. General George S. Patton, a figure who demanded visible, external courage, was reportedly deeply affected by the quiet, internal courage of the British civilians. While inspecting the vast staging areas in the south of England, he observed the remains of a village church, half destroyed in a 1941 raid, where services were still being held in the crypt. In a speech to his senior staff prior to the invasion of North Africa, Patton drew a direct parallel between the resilience he witnessed and the tenacity required for invasion. Look at the people of this island. They took the absolute worst, the fire and the steel, and they never once abandoned their posts, be it a factory floor or a pulpit. They didn't run. They dug in and fought the fire with buckets. That is the standard of tenacity I expect from the Third Army. You must be fireproof, logistics-proof and collapse-proof. The most critical technological innovation directly influenced by the Blitz was the Mulberry Harbour, the temporary artificial ports towed across the Channel on D-Day. This audacious plan was born from the realization that the primary natural ports would be systematically destroyed by the retreating Germans. The ability to assemble and maintain massive, complex structures under threat was a skill learned, perfected, and scaled up from the improvised repairs on the docks of London and Liverpool during the height of the Blitz. The British engineers who designed the Mulberry Harbours were veterans of dock and railway repair under German fire. The ultimate test of British resilience and the final technological challenge arrived in 1944, the V-weapon campaign. The V-1, or flying bomb, Fieseler F-103, was a cheap pilotless cruise missile designed for mass terror. The signature sound, the buzzing motor suddenly cutting out, was a psychological weapon. It gave civilians a terrifying few seconds to realize a ton of high explosives was falling silently toward them. The V-2, or ballistic missile, A-4, was worse. It struck without warning, traveling faster than the speed of sound, Mach 4. It was the ultimate expression of technological terror, a weapon against which there was no aerial defense. The only defense was endurance. Yet, when the V-2s began raining down on London and the southeast, the expected panic never materialized. The ARP wardens, the fire services and the engineers responded with the same weary, methodical professionalism they had employed 4 years earlier. They treated the V-2 strike, the world's first intercontinental ballistic threat, as merely another, albeit faster, variety of bomb. Dr. Julian Huxley, a civilian medical director in London, noted the bizarre final failure of German psychological warfare. They kept increasing the speed and destructive force, but they failed to calculate the exhaustion of fear. The people had been so profoundly traumatized in 1940 that by 1944 they were simply numb. The V-weapons achieved physical destruction, but utterly failed in their psychological goal. The V-weapons were the German High Command's last desperate attempt to break the bridgehead. The fact that the invasion preparations continued, the ports remained functional, and the morale of the arriving American troops was reinforced by the calm resolve of the British populace, sealed the fate of the Reich. The civilian resilience of 1940 had secured the platform for the victory of 1944-45. The ultimate victory of the Allied powers was a mosaic of courage, strategy, and industrial might. Yet, without the foundation provided by the indomitable will of the British civilian population during the Blitz, the entire edifice of the Western Front strategy would have collapsed before it was even built. The core irony remains the most profound strategic lesson of the entire campaign. The German military objective, to terrorize the population into demanding peace, was spectacularly self-defeating. Instead of a nation fractured by fear, the Luftwaffe's relentless air war forged a strategic base of operations that was unbreakable and unbowed. The final consensus among the American generals, the statement that carried the most weight back in Washington, was not a simple quote, but a unified endorsement of the British as the most reliable, tenacious, and resilient ally possible. The words of General George C. Marshall, the intellectual force behind the massive American mobilization, became the official strategic doctrine. In his final assessment of the European theater's readiness, he crystallized the human lesson. The English, when subjected to the heaviest terror, did not waver. Their recovery rate, their industrial persistence, proved to us that this was a war that could be fought to the finish from that island. Their resolve justified every ship and every dollar we sent. We did not merely gain an ally. We gained an unyielding fortress of spirit and material. This endorsement was worth more than 1,000 fighter planes. It shifted Lend-Lease from a politically charged program of charity into a vital, non-negotiable component of American national security. The total American material delivered, $31, $4 billion worth, was a debt paid to the resilience of the millions of ordinary people who fought the war of the fire hose and the shovel. The legacy of the Blitz is technological, organizational, and deeply human. It proved the strategic superiority of a decentralized, responsive, and highly motivated civilian defense structure. Technologically, it accelerated the development of quick repair methods, mobile power and water units, and reinforced communication systems, all technologies essential for sustaining a modern society under high-intensity attack. Organizationally, it cemented the model of a total societal response to crisis, where the line between military action and civilian duty is effectively erased. The organization of the ARP remains a global model for disaster management. Humanly, it demonstrated the limitlessness of human persistence. The Luftwaffe brought the full weight of 20th century industrial warfare to bear, yet failed to achieve the one thing that truly mattered, the paralysis of the human will. The fight of the civilian was not glamorous. It did not involve fighter aces or heroic tank charges. It was a monotonous, terrifying grind of sleepless nights, smoke-filled air, and the back-breaking labor of digging through rubble to save a neighbor. But it was this quiet, profound persistence that held the line, kept the factories running, and ensured that when the American armies finally arrived, the bridgehead was ready. When the sirens finally sounded the final all-clear, it was not merely a reprieve from the bombing. It was the sound of a strategic victory already won, a victory forged in the fires of London, paid for by the tireless determination of millions of civilians who simply refused to yield their ground. They never quit, and in that refusal, they created the foundation upon which the greatest counter-invasion in history was launched, and the war for civilization was ultimately won. If you found the profound human and strategic depth of this story compelling, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more deep-dive historical documentaries. Your support helps us continue to uncover the untold stories that truly defined the Second World War.